Hello everyone, and welcome to Mr. Lights On. Tonight's story is based on a submission from one of our viewers. It's personal, chilling, and unsettling, something you'd never want to experience yourself. As always, I'll narrate it from a first-person perspective, and I can only hope it doesn't haunt you as much as it haunted me. This is I Live in the Rural United States, True Horror Stories. I grew up in a tiny town in rural Kansas, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone else. The air smells of hay and freshly turned earth, and the nights are so dark you can see the Milky Way painted across the sky. It's beautiful, sure, but there's also something unsettling about being so isolated. Out here there are no street lights, no late-night diners, and no one to hear you scream if something goes wrong. I was in my early 20s when this happened, still living with my folks to save money. We had a sprawling property, complete with a dilapidated barn and acres of overgrown fields. My dad worked long hours at a factory, and my mom spent most of her time tending to her garden or canning vegetables. I didn't mind the quiet life most days. I even enjoyed it. But there were nights that made my skin crawl. Nights when the silence felt oppressive, and the shadows outside seemed to move just a little too much. It started with the sounds. At first, I thought it was just animal coyotes or raccoons rummaging around the property. We had an old chicken coop, long since abandoned, and I figured they were drawn to whatever scraps they could find. But it didn't sound like animals. It was heavier, deliberate, almost like footsteps crunching through the gravel. One night, just past midnight, I was lying in bed scrolling through my phone when I heard it again, slow, steady footsteps outside my window. My room was on the first floor, and the only thing separating me from the outside world was a thin pane of glass and a set of flimsy curtains. I froze, my thumb hovering over the screen. The footsteps stopped, replaced by a soft rustling sound, like someone brushing against the side of the house. "Dad?" I called out, my voice trembling. No answer. My parents' room was upstairs, and I could hear my dad's heavy snores echoing down the hall. That's when I knew it wasn't him. I debated whether to get up and check. Part of me thought it was probably just the wind or an animal, but another part, the part that made my stomach churn, knew better. I slid out of bed as quietly as I could and grabbed the flashlight I kept on my nightstand. My heart was pounding so hard I thought whoever or whatever was outside might hear it. Slowly, I pulled back the curtain and shone the light into the yard. Nothing. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing only the tangled weeds and the rotting wood of the barn in the distance. I let out a shaky breath and closed the curtain. I told myself it was nothing, that I was being paranoid. But as I climbed back into bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The next morning I found footprints. They were large, too large to belong to me or my dad, and they were pressed into the soft dirt just below my window. My stomach sank as I crouched down to get a better look. The prints led away from the house, disappearing into the tall grass near the edge of the property. I told my dad about it, but he just shrugged it off. "Probably some drifter passing through," he said. "Nothing to worry about." But I was worried. That night I stayed up late, determined to catch whoever or whatever was skulking around our property. I sat by the window with the flashlight in one hand and an old baseball bat in the other. Hours passed, and I was starting to think maybe I'd scared them off. And then I saw it. A figure, tall and lanky, standing just beyond the tree line. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. They weren't moving, just standing there, staring at the house. The moonlight glinted off something in their hand, something metallic. I didn't wait to find out what it was. I bolted upstairs to my parents' room, shaking my dad awake. He groaned, irritated, but when I told him what I saw, he grabbed his shotgun and headed downstairs without another word. We searched the yard together, but the figure was gone. The only sign they'd been there was a single footprint, pressed deep into the dirt near the barn. For the next few weeks, things escalated. We'd find strange symbols carved into the wooden posts of the barn, dead animals left on our porch, and once, an old rusted knife stabbed into the side of a tree near the house. My dad called the sheriff, but there wasn't much they could do. Could be kids messing around, they said. Let us know if it happens again. It wasn't kids. One night, I woke up to the sound of my bedroom door creaking open. At first, the house was eerily quiet. The kind of quiet that presses against your ears and makes you feel like you're being watched. Midnight came and went, and for a brief moment I thought maybe the house had decided to leave them alone. Then the whispers started. It was faint at first, barely audible, like a distant conversation carried on the wind. But as the minutes ticked by, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They weren't coming from any one direction, they were everywhere, surrounding us, filling the room like an invisible tide. Lisa clung to Brian, her face pale and terrified. I grabbed the flashlight I had brought with me and stood up, trying to pinpoint the source of the sound. Where is it coming from? Brian whispered, his voice trembling. Before I could answer, the lights flickered and went out. The room plunged into darkness, and the whispers stopped. For a few seconds, there was nothing but silence. Then, from the hallway, we heard Ida low, guttural growl, followed by the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and getting closer. I shone the flashlight toward the hallway, my hands shaking so badly the beam wavered. The footsteps stopped just before the light could reach them, as if whatever was there knew exactly where the shadows ended. And then, we saw it. The figure from my bedroom, tall and impossibly thin, stepped into the light. Its featureless face turned toward us, and for a moment, it just stood there, watching. Lisa let out a strangled scream, and Brian grabbed her, pulling her toward the door. "Run!" I shouted, but they were already moving. I followed them, the flashlight bouncing wildly as we stumbled out of the house and into the night. The next morning, we reviewed the footage. What we saw chilled us to the bone. The cameras had captured everything: the whispers, the flickering lights, and the figure in the hallway. But what terrified me most was what happened after we ran. The camera in the living room showed the figure standing motionless for several minutes. Then, slowly, it turned toward the camera, as if it knew it was being watched. It stepped closer, its faceless head tilting curiously until it was inches from the lens. And then, in that same shaky handwriting, words began to appear on the wall behind it, scratched into the paint by an unseen hand. "I see you. I always see you." That was the last time I ever set foot in that house. Lisa and Brian moved out a week later, leaving behind everything they couldn't carry. The house still stands, abandoned now, its windows dark and empty. Sometimes I wonder if it's still watching, waiting for its next victim. His face went pale. "I think I know what this is," he said, pulling a dusty old book from his shelf. He flipped through the pages until he found what he was looking for: a hand-drawn sketch of a figure that looked eerily similar to the one I'd seen in my room. "It's called a watcher," he said. "They're not human, not entirely anyway. They're drawn to isolated places, especially when someone invites them in." "Invites them in?" I asked, my stomach twisting. "Did you ever acknowledge it? Talk to it? Open the door for it?" I thought back to that night, to the moment I'd whispered, "Why are you here?" "Oh God," I muttered. Tyler's expression grew grim. "Once you invite it in, it doesn't leave. It feeds on fear, on your energy. The more afraid you are, the stronger it gets." I wanted to believe he was just messing with me, but deep down I knew he wasn't. Everything he said lined up too perfectly with what I'd experienced. "So what do I do?" I asked. Tyler hesitated. "There's a ritual," he said finally, "but it's dangerous if you screw it up." "What happens if I screw it up?" "You don't want to know." That night we drove back to my house. Tyler brought the book along with a duffel bag filled with candles, salt, and a small rusty dagger that looked like it belonged in a museum. "Are you sure about this?" he asked as we stood in the yard, the house looming dark and silent behind us. "I don't have a choice," I said. We set up the ritual in the barn, away from the house and my unsuspecting parents. Tyler drew a circle on the ground with salt and placed the candles at precise intervals around its edge. I stood in the center, clutching the dagger, while he chanted something in a language I didn't recognize. At first, nothing happened. The barn was silent except for the faint rustle of the wind outside. And then the temperature dropped. The air grew heavy, thick with an unnatural cold that made my breath come out in visible puffs. The candles flickered, their flames struggling against an unseen force. "It's here," Tyler whispered. The air inside the barn felt suffocating, as if the entire atmosphere had shifted into something unnatural. I gripped the dagger so tightly that my knuckles turned white, my heart pounding against my ribs. Tyler stood outside the salt circle, his face pale but focused. "No matter what happens," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "stay in the circle. Don't leave it, no matter what you see or hear. Do you understand?" I nodded, but my legs were shaking so badly I wasn't sure I could hold my ground if things got worse. And then it appeared. At first, it was just a shadow, vague, indistinct, almost like a trick of the light. But as Tyler continued chanting, it began to take form. The figure was tall and gaunt, its limbs too long, its movements jerky and unnatural. It stood just beyond the edge of the salt circle, its eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. "You don't belong here," Tyler said, his voice firm despite the tremor in his hands. "You were not invited." The figure tilted its head, the grotesque grin spreading across its face once again. "He invited me," it hissed, its voice like dry leaves scraping against stone. My stomach dropped. It was talking about me. "Don't listen to it," Tyler said quickly, his eyes darting to mine. "It's trying to break you. Focus on the dagger, keep your grip tight. You're the one who has to send it back." The figure laughed, a low, guttural sound that made my skin crawl. "You think a blade can hurt me?" it sneered, stepping closer to the circle. I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to stay still. Tyler hadn't told me everything about the ritual, but I knew one thing for sure. The salt circle was the only thing keeping it from getting to me. "Now," Tyler said, his voice urgent, "cut your palm with the dagger and let a few drops of blood fall into the center of the circle. It's the final step to sever its connection to you." I hesitated, the sharp edge of the dagger hovering over my palm. The thought of intentionally harming myself was almost too much to bear. But the figure was leaning closer now, its grotesque features distorted by the flickering candlelight. "Hurry," Tyler shouted. I took a deep breath and pressed the blade into my skin. Pain shot through my hand as the dagger bit into my flesh, but I didn't let go. A few drops of blood dripped onto the ground, staining the dirt inside the circle. The reaction was immediate. The figure let out a blood-curdling scream, its form flickering like static on an old television. It lunged at the circle, its claw-like hands outstretched, but the salt seemed to burn it like acid. Tyler's chanting grew louder, more frantic, as the figure writhed in pain. "You're banished," he shouted. "You have no power here anymore." The figure let out one final ear-piercing shriek before it dissolved into shadow, disappearing into the darkness of the barn. The oppressive weight in the air lifted, and the candles burned steady once more. It was over, or so I thought. The following days were quiet, too quiet. The strange occurrences stopped. No more footsteps outside my window, no more symbols carved into the barn, no more dead animals left on the porch. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me. Tyler assured me that the ritual had worked, that the Watcher was gone for good. But there was something he wasn't telling me. I could see it in his eyes every time I brought it up. It wasn't until weeks later that I found out the truth. I was cleaning out the barn, trying to make it feel normal again, when I noticed something scratched into one of the wooden beams near the salt circle. At first, I thought it was just one of the symbols we'd seen before, but as I looked closer, I realized it was words. "I'll be back." I stepped back, my blood running cold. That night, I slept with the lights on and the baseball bat within arm's reach. I haven't seen the Watcher since, but I know it's not gone. Not completely. And every now and then, late at night, I hear the faint sound of footsteps outside my window. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Mr. Lights On, where we dive into the eerie, the unexplained, and the terrifying stories that will haunt your nights. Tonight's tale is a personal one, sent in by a viewer who wishes to remain anonymous. They've asked me to share their chilling experience, and I promise it will leave you questioning the safety of even the most familiar places. So sit back, turn the lights off if you dare, and let's begin. I used to live in a small, unassuming town in the rural United States. You know the type: rolling fields, dirt roads, and neighbors who live so far apart you wouldn't see them unless you made the effort. For years I thought I knew every inch of my home, every sound the house made, and every shadow cast by the trees outside. But then, something happened, a series of events I can't explain and will never forget. It started with something small. One night after a particularly long day, I was lying in bed, drifting off to sleep. It was one of those nights where the silence was so profound that even the creak of the house settling felt like a thunderclap. Just as I was about to fall asleep, I heard a faint tapping sound coming from the window. At first, I thought it was the wind, maybe a branch brushing against the glass. I ignored it, but the tapping didn't stop. It was rhythmic, deliberate, like someone was outside tapping their fingers against the pane. My heart started racing. I lived alone, miles from my closest neighbor. The thought of someone standing outside in the pitch black, so far from any help, was enough to make my skin crawl. Gathering my courage, I crept out of bed and walked to the window. The tapping stopped the moment I got close. I pulled back the curtain, expecting to see nothing, but instead, I saw a shadow, just a silhouette, faint and barely discernible in the moonlight, but it was there. Someone or something was standing just outside. I froze, unsure of what to do. My first instinct was to grab my phone and call the police, but before I could move, the shadow melted into the darkness, disappearing as if it had never been there. I stayed up the rest of the night, heart pounding, every creak and groan of the house making me jump. Over the next few days, things got stranger. It wasn't just the tapping anymore. I started hearing footsteps, soft, shuffling sounds that seemed to come from just outside the house. Sometimes, I'd wake up to find the porch light on, even though I was sure I had turned it off before bed. One morning, I found muddy footprints on the front steps. They led up to the door but didn't lead away. It was as if whoever or whatever had been there had vanished into thin air. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was some kids playing a prank, or maybe an animal had gotten too curious. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. Then came the night that changed everything. It was around midnight, and I was sitting in the living room, trying to distract myself with an old movie. The room was dimly lit, the only light coming from the flickering screen and the faint glow of a lamp in the corner. That's when I heard it again, the tapping. This time, it wasn't at the window. It was coming from the front door. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. No answer. I stood up, my heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear anything else. Slowly, I made my way to the door. The tapping continued, steady and relentless. I looked through the peephole, but all I could see was darkness. Taking a deep breath, I unlocked the door and swung it open. There was nothing, just the empty porch and the vast expanse of night beyond it. I stepped outside, scanning the yard. The wind was still, the air heavy and oppressive. And then I saw something moving at the edge of the field, just beyond the reach of the porch light. It was tall and thin, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet being yanked on invisible strings. I could feel its gaze, though I couldn't see its face. It was watching me. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my hands shaking. I grabbed a flashlight and my phone and called the police. By the time they arrived, whatever had been there was gone. They found nothing, no footprints, no sign that anyone had been there at all. They chalked it up to nerves or an overactive imagination, but I knew better. For weeks after that, I couldn't sleep. Every night I'd hear something, a distant whisper, a faint knock, a shadow moving where it shouldn't be. I felt like I was being watched, like I wasn't alone. And then, one night I found something that confirmed my worst fears. It was a small, crumpled piece of paper tucked into the frame of my bedroom window. Scrawled on it, in a shaky, almost childlike handwriting, were the words, "I see you." For days after finding that note, I couldn't shake the unease that had settled deep in my bones. I couldn't focus at work, couldn't eat, couldn't think about anything other than the words, "I see you." They echoed in my mind, making me paranoid to the point that I started locking every door and window, checking them twice, sometimes 3 times before bed. But no matter how much I tried to convince myself that I was safe, I knew something or someone was out there, watching. The next escalation came 2 weeks later. It was a quiet evening. I was sitting at my kitchen table, nursing a cup of coffee, when I heard a sound that made my blood run cold, the faint, unmistakable creak of a floorboard. Inside the house, I froze. My house wasn't old enough for random creaks and groans, and even if it was, this sound was deliberate. It came from the hallway leading to my bedroom. I grabbed the closest thing I could find, a heavy cast-iron pan, and crept toward the hallway, my heart thundering in my chest. "Who's there?" I called out, trying to sound braver than I felt. Silence. I flicked on the hallway light. The space was empty. My bedroom door was ajar, just as I had left it. I edged closer, gripping the pan tightly, my palms slick with sweat. I pushed the door open the rest of the way and stepped inside. The room was empty, but then I noticed something, a chill that didn't belong. The air was icy, far colder than the rest of the house. I looked around, my eyes scanning every shadow, every corner, until they landed on the closet door. It was slightly open, just enough for a sliver of darkness to peek through. I stared at it, my breathing shallow. I hadn't opened the closet that day. I was sure of it. "Come out," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Nothing. I reached out with trembling hands and yanked the door open. The closet was empty. No clothes, no shoes, nothing. Just an expanse of darkness that seemed to stretch deeper than it should. It was wrong, like the space inside was somehow bigger than the closet itself. My flashlight barely pierced the shadows, but I could have sworn I saw something move, just a flicker of motion, deep in the darkness. I slammed the door shut and backed away, my chest heaving. That night I didn't sleep. I sat in the living room with every light in the house on, the pan still in my hands. The next day, I decided enough was enough. I called a friend, Matt, who lived a few towns over. Matt was the kind of guy who always had a solution for everything. When I told him what was going on, he didn't laugh or call me crazy. Instead, he said something that sent a shiver down my spine. "You need to leave," he said. "Whatever's happening, it's not just in your head, and it's not going to stop." Matt offered to let me stay at his place for a while, and I agreed. But first, I wanted to spend one last night in my house. I needed answers. I couldn't just leave without knowing what or why was tormenting me. That night I set up a camera in the living room, pointing toward the hallway. I figured if anything happened, I'd have proof. Then, armed with my flashlight and a baseball bat, I sat on the couch and waited. The hours dragged by. Midnight came and went, and for a while it seemed like nothing would happen. I started to let my guard down, thinking maybe the nightmare was finally over. And then, just as I was about to turn the camera off, I heard it. A faint whisper. Not words, exactly just a low, guttural sound that sent a wave of goosebumps down my arms. It came from the hallway. I grabbed the flashlight and the bat and headed toward the sound. The whispering grew louder as I approached the bedroom. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. When I reached the bedroom, the door was wide open. The closet door, too. The air was cold again, colder than I had ever felt it. And then I saw it. Standing in the middle of the room was a figure. It was tall and impossibly thin, its limbs elongated and unnatural. Its face, or what I assumed was its face, was smooth and featureless, like it was wearing a mask made of flesh. It didn't move, but I could feel its gaze, heavy and oppressive, like a physical weight pressing down on me. I don't remember screaming, but I must have, because the next thing I knew, I was outside, standing barefoot in the yard, the bat still in my hands. I looked back at the house, expecting to see the figure in the window, but the house was dark and still. When I reviewed the footage the next day, my blood turned to ice. At first, everything was normal, just me sitting on the couch, the occasional creak of the house settling. But then, around 3 a.m., the camera caught something. The closet door in the hallway opened slowly, almost imperceptibly. A shadow moved across the floor, dark and sinuous, like liquid spilling into the room. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. That was the last straw. I packed my things and left that same day. I moved in with Matt and never went back to the house. A few weeks later, I sold it to a young couple who seemed excited to live in the quiet countryside. I didn't have the heart to tell them what had happened. I didn't sleep that night or the next. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't going away. It was toying with me, letting me know it could come back whenever it wanted. I spent hours pacing the house, trying to figure out what to do. Every shadow outside the window, every creak of the floorboards, felt like a warning. The next morning, I drove back into town to see Earl again. This time, I demanded answers. I showed him a photo of the symbol carved in front of my porch, and for a moment, I thought he was going to pass out. "That's a binding sigil," he said finally, his voice trembling. "Whoever put that there, they were trying to keep something trapped." "Trapped?" I asked. "You mean it was already here?" Earl nodded. "These woods have a long history, boy. Long before settlers came here, this land was considered cursed. People saw things, heard things. The old-timers used to tell stories about a creature that lived out here, a guardian, they called it. But it wasn't protecting anything good. It was keeping people away from something dark, something evil. Then why is it after me?" I asked, my voice rising. "I didn't do anything." Earl looked at me with a mix of pity and fear. "It's not after you, son. It's after what you stirred up. Those symbols you saw on the trees, they're a warning. Somebody was trying to keep that thing contained, and now it's loose." I felt like the ground was shifting beneath me. "How do I stop it?" I asked, desperation creeping into my voice. Earl hesitated, then leaned in close. "You can't stop it. The best you can do is get out of its way. Leave the house, leave the land, and don't ever come back." I wanted to argue, to tell him I couldn't just abandon my home. But deep down, I knew he was right. Whatever was happening, it was bigger than me, and it wasn't something I could fight with a shotgun or floodlights. Still, leaving wasn't an option, not yet. I needed closure, needed to understand what had been unleashed. So, against Earl's advice, I decided to confront the creature one last time. That night, I prepared as best I could. I gathered salt, candles, and an old Bible I found in a drawer, hoping that some combination of superstition and faith might offer protection. I also set up cameras around the property, determined to capture whatever. At first, the house was eerily quiet, the kind of quiet that presses against your ears and makes you feel like you're being watched. Midnight came and went, and for a brief moment I thought maybe the house had decided to leave them alone. Then the whispers started. It was faint at first, barely audible, like a distant conversation carried on the wind. But as the minutes ticked by, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They weren't coming from any one direction, they were everywhere, surrounding us, filling the room like an invisible tide. Lisa clung to Brian, her face pale and terrified. I grabbed the flashlight I had brought with me and stood up, trying to pinpoint the source of the sound. "Where is it coming from?" Brian whispered, his voice trembling. Before I could answer, the lights flickered and went out. The room plunged into darkness, and the whispers stopped. For a few seconds, there was nothing but silence. Then, from the hallway, we heard Ida low, guttural growl, followed by the sound of footsteps. slow, deliberate, and getting closer. I shone the flashlight toward the hallway, my hands shaking so badly the beam wavered. The footsteps stopped just before the light could reach them, as if whatever was there knew exactly where the shadows ended. And then we saw it. The figure from my bedroom, tall and impossibly thin, stepped into the light. Its featureless face turned toward us, and for a moment, it just stood there, watching. Lisa let out a strangled scream, and Brian grabbed her, pulling her toward the door. "Run!" I shouted, but they were already moving. I followed them, the flashlight bouncing wildly as we stumbled out of the house and into the night. The next morning, we reviewed the footage. What we saw chilled us to the bone. The cameras had captured everything: the whispers, the flickering lights, and the figure in the hallway. But what terrified me most was what happened after we ran. The camera in the living room showed the figure standing motionless for several minutes. Then, slowly, it turned toward the camera, as if it knew it was being watched. It stepped closer, its faceless head tilting curiously until it was inches from the lens. And then, in that same shaky handwriting, words began to appear on the wall behind it, scratched into the paint by an unseen hand. "I see you. I always see you." That was the last time I ever set foot in that house. Lisa and Brian moved out a week later, leaving behind everything they couldn't carry. The house still stands, abandoned now, its windows dark and empty. Sometimes I wonder if it's still watching, waiting for its next victim. This one struck a nerve because it reminded me just how terrifying the ordinary can be. It comes from deep in the rural United States, where isolation and silence are often broken by things we can't explain. So, let's dive right in. The story begins a few years back when I was living alone in a small house nestled in the woods of rural Kentucky. It was the kind of place where you could go days without seeing a neighbor, and where the nights were so dark that even a flashlight struggled to pierce the inky blackness. I had moved there to escape the chaos of city life, craving solitude and the chance to focus on my writing. The house was modest but sturdy, a single-story cabin with a wraparound porch and a fireplace that crackled during the cold winter months. The land around it was dense with trees, and there was an old barn about 50 yards from the house that I used to store tools and firewood. It wasn't much, but it was mine, and for a while, it was perfect. Things started to change one night in late September. The air was crisp, and the leaves had just begun to turn. I was sitting on my porch, sipping a cup of coffee, when I heard it for the first time, a low, guttural sound coming from the woods. It wasn't an animal I recognized, and trust me, living out here, you learn to identify all kinds of wildlife. This sound was different. It was deep and resonant, almost like a growl, but with an eerie, human-like quality. At first, I brushed it off as my imagination or maybe some distant coyote, but as the night wore on, the sound came closer. By midnight, it seemed to be circling my property, always just out of sight. I tried to ignore it and went to bed, but the feeling of unease lingered. That night, I dreamed of shadows moving through the trees, their eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. The next morning, I went out to investigate. I found nothing unusual, no tracks, no broken branches, nothing to suggest what had been making those noises. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. Over the next few weeks, the activity escalated. It wasn't just the noises anymore. I started finding strange markings carved into the trees around my property, symbols I didn't recognize, but they looked deliberate. At first, I thought it might be kids playing a prank, but the precision of the carvings didn't seem like the work of bored teenagers. They were too intricate, too purposeful. One night, I woke up to the sound of banging on my front door. My heart was pounding as I grabbed the shotgun I kept by the bed and crept toward the door. Peering through the peephole, I saw nothing but darkness. The banging stopped, replaced by the faint sound of footsteps retreating into the woods. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. Instead, I sat by the window, shotgun in hand, watching the tree line. Every so often, I thought I saw movement, just a flicker of something slipping between the shadows. By morning, I was exhausted but determined to figure out what was going on. That day, I decided to check the barn. I hadn't been inside in weeks, but something told me I needed to look. As I approached, I noticed the door was slightly ajar, which was odd because I always kept it locked. Stepping inside, the first thing I noticed was the smell of rancid, metallic stench that made my stomach churn. The source of the smell was in the corner of the barn. There, piled on the floor, were the remains of several animals: rabbits, squirrels, even a deer. They were arranged in a circular pattern, their bodies mutilated in ways that made my skin crawl. At the center of the circle was another carving, this one etched into the barn floor. It was the same symbol I had seen on the trees, but larger and more detailed. I stumbled out of the barn, barely holding back the urge to vomit. My first instinct was to call the police, but what would I say? That some unknown force was leaving cryptic symbols and animal sacrifices on my property? They'd think I was crazy. I spent the rest of the day in a fog of paranoia. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind outside felt like a threat. By the time night fell, I had all the lights in the house on and my shotgun loaded and within arm's reach. Sleep was out of the question. Around midnight, the noises started again, the low, guttural growls from the woods. This time they were louder, closer, almost as if they were mocking me. I sat in my living room, clutching the shotgun, my ears straining for any hint of movement. Then I heard it, footsteps on the porch. It wasn't the timid tread of an animal. These were heavy, deliberate steps, like someone or something was testing the boards. My breath caught in my throat as the footsteps moved toward the front door. I aimed the shotgun at the door and yelled, "Who's there? I'm armed." The footsteps stopped. For a moment, the only sound was the pounding of my own heart. Then, slowly, the doorknob began to turn. I fired. The blast echoed through the house, and the door shuddered but didn't open. Whatever was on the other side let out an ear-piercing screech, a sound so unnatural it made my skin crawl. I heard the footsteps retreat, pounding down the porch steps and disappearing into the woods. I didn't dare open the door to investigate. Instead, I stayed awake until the first light of dawn, my hands shaking and my mind racing with questions. The next morning, I found scratches on the door long, deep gouges that couldn't have been made by any animal I knew. I also found something else, a tuft of hair caught in the splintered wood. It was coarse and black, and when I touched it, my fingers tingled, like it was charged with static electricity. I decided enough was enough. I packed a bag, locked up the house, and drove into town. There, I told my story to the only person I thought might believe me, an old man named Earl who owned the local hardware store. Earl was a bit of a recluse, but he had a reputation for knowing all the old stories and legends of the area. When I showed him the tuft of hair, his face went pale. He took a long drag of his cigarette and said, "You've got something on your land, boy, something that ain't natural." I pressed him for more details, but he was reluctant to say much. All he told me was that the symbols I'd seen were associated with ancient rituals meant to summon or bind spirits. "If you're smart," he said, "you'll leave and not look back." But I couldn't just leave. That house was my home, and besides, I wasn't sure I could live with myself if I walked away without knowing the truth. That night, I returned home, determined to face whatever was tormenting me. I set up a series of floodlights around the property, hoping to keep whatever it was at bay. I also set up my phone to record, figuring if nothing else, I'd have proof of what was happening. The night was eerily quiet at first. No growls, no footsteps, just the hum of the floodlights and the chirping of crickets. But around 3 a.m., the lights began to flicker. Then, one by one, they went out. I grabbed my shotgun and my flashlight, stepping out onto the porch. The air was thick with the scent of ozone, and the hair on the back of my neck stood on end. As I scanned the yard, the beam of my flashlight landed on a figure standing at the edge of the tree line. It was tally easily 7 or 8 feet, and its body was gaunt, its skin a sickly gray that seemed to absorb the light. Its face, I'll never forget its face. It had no eyes, just empty sockets that seemed to stare straight into my soul. Its mouth was a gaping maw filled with jagged, uneven teeth, and it was smiling. Before I could react, it let out that same ear-piercing screech and began to move toward me, its long limbs jerking unnaturally. I fired the shotgun, but the creature didn't even flinch. Instead, it lunged, and I barely managed to slam the door shut in time. For the next hour, I could hear it outside, scratching at the walls, banging on the windows, trying to find a way in. I was trapped, helpless, and certain I wasn't going to survive the night. But then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The scratching, the banging, it all just ceased. When I finally worked up the courage to look outside, the creature was gone. All that remained were the deep gouges in the walls and a single symbol carved into the ground in front of the porch. I didn't sleep that night or the next. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't going away. It was toying with me, letting me know it could come back whenever it wanted. I spent hours pacing the house, trying to figure out what to do. Every shadow outside the window, every creak of the floorboards, felt like a warning. The next morning, I drove back into town to see Earl again. This time, I demanded answers. I showed him a photo of the symbol carved in front of my porch, and for a moment, I thought he was going to pass out. "That's a binding sigil," he said finally, his voice trembling. "Whoever put that there, they were trying to keep something trapped." "Trapped?" I asked. "You mean it was already here?" Earl nodded. "These woods have a long history, boy. Long before settlers came here, this land was considered cursed. People saw things, heard things. The old-timers used to tell stories about a creature that lived out here, a guardian, they called it. But it wasn't protecting anything good. It was keeping people away from something dark, something evil. Then why is it after me?" I asked, my voice rising. "I didn't do anything." Earl looked at me with a mix of pity and fear. "It's not after you, son. It's after what you stirred up. Those symbols you saw on the trees, they're a warning. Somebody was trying to keep that thing contained, and now it's loose." I felt like the ground was shifting beneath me. "How do I stop it?" I asked, desperation creeping into my voice. Earl hesitated, then leaned in close. "You can't stop it. The best you can do is get out of its way. Leave the house, leave the land, and don't ever come back." I wanted to argue, to tell him I couldn't just abandon my home. But deep down, I knew he was right. Whatever was happening, it was bigger than me, and it wasn't something I could fight with a shotgun or floodlights. Still, leaving wasn't an option, not yet. I needed closure, needed to understand what had been unleashed. So, against Earl's advice, I decided to confront the creature one last time. That night, I prepared as best I could. I gathered salt, candles, and an old Bible I found in a drawer, hoping that some combination of superstition and faith might offer protection. I also set up cameras around the property, determined to capture whatever happened. As the sun set, a sense of dread settled over me. The air felt heavy, and the woods were unnaturally quiet. Even the crickets were silent. By midnight, I was sitting in the living room, the candles casting flickering shadows on the walls. My shotgun was by my side, though I doubted it would do any good. It started with the growls, low and guttural, coming from all directions. Then, the scratching began in the walls, the roof, even the windows. I held my breath as the sounds grew louder, more frantic, until it felt like the house was under siege. And then, everything stopped. The silence was deafening, oppressive. My ears strained for any sound, but there was nothing. Slowly, I stood and moved to the front door, my hands trembling. I peered through the peephole and saw nothing. But when I opened the door, I found the porch covered in symbols, each one glowing faintly in the darkness. At the edge of the yard, the creature stood, its hollow eyes fixed on me. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, staring. I don't know what possessed me, but I stepped outside, clutching the Bible in one hand and the shotgun in the other. "What do you want?" I shouted, my voice shaking. The creature tilted its head, its grotesque smile widening. Then it raised one long, clawed finger and pointed to the barn. The barn. I knew deep down that whatever was happening had started there. Maybe it was the symbols, or the animal remains, or something else entirely. But if I wanted answers, that was where I had to go. I lit a lantern and made my way to the barn, my heart pounding with every step. The door creaked open, revealing the dark interior. The smell hit me first, that same rancid, metallic stench that had greeted me before. But this time, it was stronger, almost overwhelming. In the center of the barn, where I'd found the animal remains before, the ground had been disturbed. The earth was loose, as if something had been dug up or buried. At first I hesitated, but then I grabbed a shovel and began to dig. The deeper I went, the colder the air became. My hands were shaking, sweat pouring down my face. But I kept digging until the shovel hit something solid. It was a box, an old, weathered wooden box bound with iron chains. Carved into its surface were more of those symbols, though these were faded and worn. As I stared at it, I felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of dread. I knew I shouldn't open it. Every instinct screamed at me to leave it alone, but I couldn't stop myself. My hands moved on their own, pulling at the chains until they snapped. I pried the lid open, and inside the box was a bundle of cloth, stained dark with age. I hesitated, my breath caught in my throat, but something compelled me to reach out. My fingers trembled as I pulled back the fabric, revealing what lay beneath. It was a small, withered object no bigger than a loaf of bread. At first I thought it was a doll, but as the lantern's light flickered over it, I realized it wasn't. The thing looked human, or at least it had been once. Its leathery skin was stretched tight over tiny bones, its features grotesquely shrunken, but its mouth was twisted into a grimace of pure agony. As I stared, a strange sensation washed over me, a mix of nausea and dizziness, like the air around me had turned viscous. The barn seemed to darken, the light from the lantern dimming as if being swallowed by the shadows. Then, from the depths of the woods, I heard it. The screech, the same unholy sound I'd heard outside my house, only now it was louder, angrier. I stumbled back, dropping the box as the screech grew closer. The ground beneath me seemed to tremble, and the air was filled with a low, guttural growl that made my chest vibrate. Suddenly, the creature appeared at the barn's entrance. Its hollow eyes locked onto me, and for the first time, I felt its rage. The creature stepped forward, its long limbs jerking unnaturally, and I knew I had made a grave mistake. It wasn't just angry, it was furious. Whatever I had unearthed, it had been meant to stay buried, and now I'd unleashed something far worse than I could have imagined. In a blind panic, I grabbed the box and ran. I don't remember how I made it back to the house, but when I slammed the door shut behind me, I realized the growls had stopped. The silence was deafening, but it didn't feel like relief, it felt like the calm before the storm. I spent the rest of the night in a daze, clutching the shotgun and staring at the box on the table. The withered object inside seemed to pulse faintly, as though it were alive. I thought about Earl's words. This land was considered cursed. It was keeping something dark at bay. Had I just undone whatever protection had been in place? Was the creature part of that curse, or was it the thing that had been guarding us from something even worse? By morning, I made up my mind. I had to return the box to the barn and seal it back up. I didn't care what it took, I just needed this nightmare to end. I grabbed salt, matches, and a heavy tarp, determined to make it right. As I approached the barn, the woods were eerily silent. Even the birds seemed to have fled. The barn door creaked open, revealing the disturbed ground where I'd dug the night before. I stepped inside, my every instinct screaming at me to turn back, and began to rebury the box. The air grew colder with each shovelful of dirt I tossed into the hole. My breath came out in visible puffs, and the hair on my arms stood on end. As I worked, I could feel the creature watching me, though I didn't dare look up. Its presence was oppressive, a weight pressing down on my chest. Finally, the box was buried, and I scattered salt over the disturbed earth, muttering prayers I barely remembered from childhood. I set the tarp over the spot and lit a match, letting the flames consume the fabric. The fire roared to life, the smoke curling upward like black tendrils into the sky. For a moment, I thought it had worked. The oppressive weight lifted, and the air seemed to clear. But then, from the shadows of the barn, the creature stepped forward. Its hollow eyes burned with an unnatural light, and it let out a low, guttural growl that shook me to my core. I froze, unable to move as it approached. Then, to my shock, it stopped. It stood over the burning tarp, its grotesque face twisted into something resembling a smile. For a moment, I thought it was going to attack, but instead, it reached out with one long, clawed hand and pointed at me. Then, it turned and disappeared into the woods. I didn't wait to see if it would come back. I packed up what little I could carry and left the house that same day, leaving everything else behind. I never returned to that land, and as far as I know, no one else has lived there since. I've spent years trying to make sense of what happened. Was the creature truly evil, or was it something else, something meant to guard against the darkness I had disturbed? I don't have the answers, and honestly, I'm not sure I want them. All I know is that some things are better left buried. So, to anyone listening, if you ever find yourself alone in the woods, surrounded by strange symbols and unexplainable events, take my advice, leave. Don't try to understand it. Don't try to fight it. Just go. Because sometimes, the scariest thing isn't what you see, it's what you don't. That's all for tonight, folks. This was sent in as a true story, and if it doesn't make you think twice about exploring rural America alone, I don't know what will. Thanks for tuning in to Mr. Lights On, and as always, keep the lights on.